My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And we're taking a journey to a very special place as revolution comes to the kingdom.
Listeners, as you may well know, I am utterly shameless when it comes to self-promotion or promoting the books that I publish on the show. I don't mind the hustle. I believe in the hustle. I embrace the hustle. Tom also publishes role-playing game books, and we never talk about those, or hardly ever. So I wanted to set aside some time to talk to Tom about his game, Revolution Comes to the Kingdom. So we're doing something a little different today. We're doing an interview with Tom. Tom, welcome to Fear of a Black Dragon.
Yeah, it's exciting to be here. I'm a big fan of your other podcast, the good one with Judd Carlman. So it's exciting to get this opportunity.
Okay, so all joking aside, let's talk about Revolution Comes to the Kingdom. Maybe start by just telling us what is the game about and what are the player characters doing.
Okay, so it's a standalone little game currently in development, and it is set in the Kingdom, the titular place and setting that never really gets a name, and it's a small country in the 1950s or 60s. It's not an easy place to travel, having 8 valleys. That's an important feature, that are separated by rugged mountains, and popular rebellion is fighting against a corrupt monarchy, or possibly a military splinter group is trying to enact a coup against the rightful government. It sort of depends on who you ask. And so the kind of default campaign frame, and default in the sense it's kind of easier to manage as a player or as the GM, is that the PCs are a group affiliated with one side or the other of the Civil War. Although there's also room to kind of charter a middle unaffiliated course that's more difficult in and out of character. Yeah, that's the basic idea. There's sort of a fictional 20th century nation that's being torn apart by a brushfire war, and you're sort of thrown into the middle of that.
That's really interesting. I've read through the documents that you have available for the game, and I was reading through it, and I got about halfway through, and I started asking myself, Tom, where's the nerd stuff at? Like, where's the nerd stuff at? Where are the vampires? Where are the ghosts? Where's all that stuff? If you hope to sell more than 10 copies, where's that stuff, Tom? And happily, you did have something like that. Tell us about that part of the game.
Okay, yeah, maybe I should ground it in with the first part as well. So, as you know, I'm very committed to niche products, so selling more than 10 copies is not, the sort of basic gameplay of RCTK, as the abbreviation goes, because it's a long name. It's inspired by real-life accounts of resistance fighters and brushfire wars and so on. So it's like about difficult journeys and prison breaks and mercenaries who work for mining corporations or capturing radio transmitters, CIA minders, creeping past guards, running away from sniffer dogs, or this kind of thing. Got to say, so far in playtesting games, breaking out of jails or breaking people out of jails seems to be the most common single activity. But yeah, there is this sort of second aspect to it, which is about the kind of spiritual renewal of the kingdom as well. So to move forward personally and to help the kingdom do the same, the PCs have to travel to each of the 8 valleys and conquer its spiritual afflictions, right? Which involves first gaining access to the valley's key location, called a fastness, which could be difficult depending on who is in control of that location. They've got to guide the broader community to a spiritual awakening, enact a symbolic action, but also, and this is where the nerd stuff comes in, conquer the challenges they find in the catacomb beneath that fastness, which is a kind of subterranean location that is of spiritual significance and dreamlike reality, and that's where you find all your monsters and where you throw in your pre-existing OSR dungeons, except this time you're taking them on with AK-47s and so on, rather than kind of Tolkien-esque fantasy.
Yeah, that's really great. I want to come back to that. I just wanted you to kind of put it out there on the table a little bit. Because I was already kind of hooked by the idea of a game about revolution. I'm a story gamer at my core, and story games love real world or real world inspired themes and settings like this. Like, that's something that you can find a lot. Dog Eat Dog is a great example. But it was curious because, like, we haven't talked about mechanics yet, and I think we will, but this game is definitely much more OSR flavored, which I think is interesting, and in terms of the mechanics, and yet it was kind of dealing with this non-fantastical setting and theme until you sort of introduced this idea of this sort of like cleansing the spirit of the place and going down into the catacombs of the fastnesses. I was intrigued initially, and I was even like pulled in further by this idea of adding this like sort of spiritual component. So I think that's super fascinating. You have a quote in the text that reads, "I know all about you, how you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were one or the other, but since you are neither, but only lukewarm, I will spit you out of my mouth." I love that quote. Is that from something? How does it apply to what this game is about?
Okay, yeah. So it's from chapter 3 of the Book of Revelation, and it's from one of the messages that's to be directed to a particular church in the Book of Revelation. That's not really relevant to the game, though. As to how it connects, I mean, I'm a Death of the Author guy, so it's not really my place to say, but for me, it's something to do with, and I should say it's pasted over a photo of a military checkpoint searching civilian cars as they go along the road, right? So to me, it reflects maybe the foolishness of going along to get along, how people can be blind to the fragility of a situation that seems stable, but actually it's only a few days away from turning into something completely unbearable. The following verse might be relevant as well, which is, "You say, I am rich, I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing, but you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." So, yeah, something like that.
Great, love that.
Well, so let's talk about the mechanics of the game. This was really interesting to me. I'll tell you that at the outset, it didn't grab me, but that's no surprise because I'm not like an OSR gamer, like mechanically speaking, it's not my thing. But I do think you're doing a lot of really interesting things here, and I want to talk about some of them. What are just the basic sort of mechanics of Revolution Comes to the Kingdom?
Oh, I mean, the basics are undescribably boring. So you've got a skill score and a strength score like in Advanced Fighting Fantasy, and you roll d20s under them, or you contest against other people by rolling and adding, blah, 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 whatever. But the interesting part for me of the game is where you apply those in specific ways. There's like a little mini game right at the back that I don't think anyone's read for having duels or gunfights in a Wild West style. And also, yeah, there's little systems for propaganda or for seeing and being seen, like the stealth component of the game, which is probably the key action scene component, I would say. Stuff like that. So it's sort of designed to be relatively modular and take apartable because that's important. I do sort of want it to work for people who only want to play BX D&D as well, if they just want to grab little packets of it.
Let's get into some of the granular things here as far as the mechanics go. The game has damage rolls only combat, which people will probably know comes from Into the Odd and Electric Bastion Land. First of all, just what is it? And then, why was that the right move?
Yeah, sure. So in Revolution and in Electric Bastion Land, you never roll to hit. So if you've got a weapon that does D8 damage, you just roll your D8, and that's how many hit points your opponent loses. The reason I wanted this is because by the time you get to swinging your fist or pointing a gun and either pulling the trigger or saying reach for the sky, because in Revolution you can remove hit points before you get to critical hits with psychological threats, basically. So getting the drop on someone is in some ways as valuable as literally shooting them. But the reason that I wanted this is the same as Chris McDowell of Bastionland fame described in a blog post he did a while back, which is about decisive combat. He sort of elucidates it as there's 3 stages of a fight, right? There's starting it, so deciding, is this a fight we want to be in? Maybe you decide this is too dangerous, let's get out of here. Second is actually fighting, execution, and then you're at a sort of tactical point. You've they've got a good few shots in, you've had a few good shots, someone's injured, should we flee or not? And then the third is the conclusion, where everything's over, but the situation has changed. And Chris describes doing it this way with just damage rolls as accelerating that process. It's the minimum amount of time and space between each of those points. And I wanted the same thing for Revolution, and that also ties into target acquisition aspects that come in later, because those fights and conflicts only happen once everything's out in the open and you're kind of firing away at each other. That's when everything, it's almost too late to do anything about it. And the kind of where you would normally have a to-hit roll in an RPG, in Revolution, that's when you're kind of moving around in cover, trying to see your enemy before they see you, or indeed trying to avoid them completely. Yeah, once you get to gunfights or stabbing matches, it's already very near the end, basically.
Yeah, I kind of like that. It's like combat is a fail state.
To a degree, yeah. Like, so unless you're really confident that you're going to overwhelm the enemy with your sudden show of force, which is going to overmatch.
Yeah, that makes sense. But as you've explained it just now, it actually is super appealing because, as you know, I'm playing lots of Trophy Gold right now, and Trophy Gold's combat is basically that. It's a sort of, okay, we start the combat, that's the weak point, then we have a die roll, that's how it kind of resolves, and then we maybe do a second die roll or third die roll, but for the most part, there's like just one die roll, and then you have kind of like the resolution of it. You sort of do the housekeeping at the end. What I think is interesting is that you've taken that kind of simple, straightforward, streamlined combat system and applied it to these other contexts, which are not just combat. Doesn't it sort of implicate the stealth and squad mechanics as well?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I don't want to sort of make it sound like it's a stealth game in the sense that Splinter Cell is or something, right? It's not, or Ollie Jeffrey's Night Rain. It's not like that. This is more inspired by maybe kind of 90s vintage tabletop miniatures war games and stuff. I remember being very confused as a young kid around like the local games club when I was sort of joined in some large kind of tanks and infantrymen World War II game. I was like, okay, so, I played 40k. I knew how to fire a tank at a guy. I was like, okay, so I'll fire at that tank over there. And it's like, whoa, kid. You got to acquire your target first. And I was like, what? So you got to see if they can see them, right? They've got to try and spot the target before they can fire. And that's really what it's about. It's that kind of stealth. You're sort of snipers in the jungle or kind of getting advantageous positions, quote unquote, combat. That's the battle. That's where the conflict is. And that's what kind of uses the initiative system, which I ripped off from Troika.
Oh, talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah. Because Troika, well, they use counters. I use playing cards because I don't have counters. Basically, every PC gets 2 cards that you put into your initiative deck. So you might be the 2 red 6s, and when your card comes up, you get an action. NPCs get basically 1 each plus 1 just for luck. Then there's 1 Joker in there as well. When the Joker comes up, the turn is over, or the cards go back in. So on average, in theory, you have up to 2 actions per turn, but maybe that's not going to happen. And that works really well in Troika for, fighting or whatnot. But as we've discovered, and I feel okay about singing the praises of this system because I didn't invent it, it's great for sneaking around and stuff. Like, we had scenes like things that would be quite mundane, like creeping across a warehouse and hoping you won't be seen by some guards. We spent basically an hour doing that, and it was so fun because, you never know when you're going to get a chance to scoot across to this bit of cover, or do they get a chance to use an action to try and see you over there in the dark. It's just really good because you can sort of game it, right? Because you're not sort of just rolling and thinking about percentage chances. You're also not really resource managing in a sort of gumshoey way, which is good because that massively leads to paralysis in my experience as people try to decide whether they should spend 2 or 3 points on a single roll. But it has a bit of a nice in-between decision to make because, you can stick your card back in the deck to hold your action, but it might not happen. So, yeah. So it's a system that, like, on the face of it, just seems a bit like a gimmick in Troika. I know people have said, what's the point of that? But actually, it's got more going on than you might at first think.
That's super interesting. I want to switch over to squads because I don't think this is something that role-playing games really do. I'm trying to think of games that have gang or squad mechanics. Apocalypse World comes to mind. Maybe I haven't played enough games. I don't know. But why was that important to include in the game, both in terms of like the game's themes and setting, and what is it doing mechanically? Like, how does it work?
Okay, so mechanically it's, squads kind of appear in Bastion Land as well. Like, they're these groups that they can hurt you a lot, but you can't really hurt them unless you have some kind of means of doing so. Like an unusual advantage, a giant machine gun, for example, that kind of thing. But what they do in Revolution is they kind of replicate the function of, in a video game like Far Cry, that moment when you haven't managed to eliminate the guards without being noticed, and they hit the alarm button. The key difference is that, like in Revolution, once the alarm is raised, these sort of individual opponents go from being single soldiers dozing around at their checkpoint to being a squad that you are now going to have real trouble with. And that's the point where you need to try and probably get away from them. You can't really hurt them. they can definitely hurt you. They're sort of now moving around en masse on one initiative action, that kind of thing. So mechanically, they're just suddenly tougher. And it's probably your fault that they activated, basically. It's sort of it's not a fail state, but it is like part of the stealth game is to try not to trigger actions that will set these people off. Like a standard setup is a couple of guards, an inactive squad, and then if it becomes active, then you're in trouble. It's like your sort of generic stealth game encounter, basically. Basically, I didn't want to have different mechanics for when there's loads of people running around firing guns. I also didn't want to have to deal with like 25 individual characters on a single NPCs and stuff. So I thought this is a good... So far, it's proved to be a good measure that balances those two things.
Yeah, no, I like it. Now that I think on it, there's obviously lots of games that abstract large groups of people to make the bookkeeping and the role play smoother. Is it possible to have like squads like on your side? Is that a thing you can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sort of see... this is part of the book I haven't really written yet, but kind of, recruiting squads and kind of bringing them with you. Because, of course, that's another way to sort of... It's your classic quest giver thing is, you can borrow a squad of my guys, but first I need you to go over here and deal with this thing, So, that's definitely part of the genre. There's the video gamey aspect of it, but also the World War II resistance things where there is a group that will help you, but they've got an agenda.
Right. So, that is such a genre thing. Do the thing to get the assistance of the group. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Maybe we can switch back over to the setting and the sort of revolution idea. The game has a very real-world feel. This is informed in part by the fact that you've included photographs as a sort of major feature of the visual design, like real-world photographs. It's a real-world feel that put me in mind of, like, say, Cologne. There was a familiarity there, but it's not actually a real place. What real-world influences did you have in mind when you were writing this? And maybe what about your own personal experiences in the world informed this game design?
Yeah, in terms of the imagery and the setting, I was sort of thinking back mostly to stuff I learned about the Second Chimurenga in Zimbabwe. So that's sort of late 60s and 70s, the revolution against what was then Rhodesia. Also, the political setting or the geopolitical setting in some ways draws on the Irish War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War. The look of it is kind of inspired by the genre that doesn't really exist, but in terms of just history, things like the British and Dutch occupations of Indonesia after the Second World War. I mean, that must have been a great conversation after World War II. Hello, chaps, we've got rid of the Japanese. Oh, great. And we're bringing the Dutch back. Oh, thanks. So there's that, and then things like the Congo Crisis, also the 60s. Wait, actually, I'm not going to simplify the politics of the Congo Crisis. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So it's sort of, in many ways, sort of resembles that. The fact that it's a proxy war, that's another thing that is involved in RCTK. That sort of, if you choose to buy a few cheap guns off the Soviets, you're going to be marked as anti-American or vice versa, even if you don't necessarily care or want to be involved with them. And then, like more broadly, just the sort of the propaganda and the civilian life part of it. That's sort of to do with World War II, post-war movements, and of course, contemporary Hong Kong, this sort of idea of people forming networks that remain unseen and the different kinds of activities that people do to create solidarity and to change their mode of living while preferably at the same time avoiding violence from the state.
I'm really into that. Why was it important for you to write this game?
I just sort of kept thinking about it, right? To start with, and then you start to write down ideas and then it turns into a game. I mean, I think you're right that the catacombs and the fastnesses, I think they are really important because this is all fun. The catacombs, in a way, are sort of the wacky, funnest part of the whole thing. It's a chance to cut loose from the gritty tension you've been doing in the ordinary world. Because, if you die in the catacombs, you just sort of wake up back at the entrance. You got stabbed to pieces by giant cracked porcelain statues, but, it's over now and you can have another go later. So the stakes are lower. But at the same time, it's what they... and the fastness liberating mechanics represent as well, is that all this kind of adventure about daring raids, escapes and gunfights and code books, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a sideshow unless it's also part of a deeper transformation of yourself and of everyone. That's what I kept coming back to. I mean, more blandly, the trigger, I think, was that I kept sort of thinking about this idea of OSR being fantasy non-fiction, but it occurred to me that there don't seem to be any existing games that are not inspired by fiction. So I thought, well, what if I just did that? There is a danger to that, though, because one of the reasons it has to be a sort of Ruritanian fantasy is that it's fundamentally pretty disrespectful to people to take real conflicts and turn them into a game. And that's one reason why the look and the actual situation are deliberately mismatched.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, it's not the Indonesian Revolution of the game. Apart from the time period, it's completely different from that, pretty much. So it sort of hopefully cuts across the unifying elements of all these different things, like in all parts of the world and in a lot of different times, I hope. But yeah, these are all kind of things that I think about a lot. So as with most game design, it might just be catharsis.
That's really interesting. I want to switch over to the fastnesses and the catacombs and this sort of more like spiritual and supernatural side of this game, because I think it's really fascinating. My sort of gentle ribbing at the top of the program is actually something that I think people will say or think about this game, which is, oh, this is just nerd service, right? Like this is just to make it a marketable RPG or whatever. Whether that's true or not, that's what some people will say. Just from what I've read, it has almost like a magical realism quality to it. That's not quite the right description, but it's interesting in the way that these sort of supernatural elements assert themselves. Because when I think about some media, movies and things, documentaries, documentaries too, that I've enjoyed in the past, that deal with very, very heavy subjects. Sometimes the way that these subjects can be presented so that they go down easier or so that they're more like easy to process is the creator introduces some sort of magical realism or absurdist element into the story. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but there was this documentary about this sort of like general from the Khmer Rouge who like committed all these atrocities, and they found him and they did this documentary about him, but they like intercut it with like these dance and musical numbers as almost like a sort of jarring juxtaposition about the subject matter and like the presentation. And I got kind of a similar vibe with this. Like it's a sort of a departure from the seriousness of the subject matter, but it sort of like reinforces the subject matter in its way because it is kind of a departure. Is that a fair characterization, or am I just totally in left field right now?
It's a deliberate departure, yeah. Like just to kind of, it's going to sound bad, but yeah, to sort of to break the monotony. Because I mean, let's be honest, paramilitary operations are kind of a bit samey after a while. It's a bit of a pressure valve. That's one purpose of it, of like the having the little dungeon bits, right? It's also a way to pace and frame the ongoing game. So the way you level up is by doing this stuff. There's no other way to do it in the game.
Right, yeah.
You've got to travel to all these different places in the kingdom. You've got to visit everywhere in the kingdom to finish the game, basically, if you want to think of it that way. So that was important. Yeah, it is this idea of a sort of heightened reality that will, weirdly, is sort of designed to create quote-unquote emergent theme, because the fact is that even though I'm writing these bits about, example, catacombs to explore and so on, because I can't know which of the 8 evil thoughts, maybe more about them in a minute, your group is going to have assigned to this valley, I also therefore can't know how that's going to intersect with the imagery that you'll find in the catacomb. So it's a kind of Eisenstein style matching shots. It's, hey, Soviet film theory's back. It's like you're matching these things together, and like what that creates is a little bit randomized and not controllable by me, the game's author. But I can put in these... It's not a very conscious process for me. I just sort of ideate these, what I think of as quite strong dream images, which is what tends to go into the catacombs. So it's like a sort of an exploration of what I associate with the things that are going on in the ordinary world of the setting.
Can we talk about the 8 evil thoughts? What are they? Well,
sure. I mean, the 8 evil thoughts are a precursor to the 7 deadly sins, because obviously the 7 deadly sins, it's not like these semantic fields are nailed down. So before that was like the classic go-to description of moral wrongdoing and so on, or concupiscence. I forget which of the Desert Fathers it was, but he came up with the 8 evil thoughts instead. And I thought, well, that's, if I go 7 deadly sins, it's going to be a bit on the nose. Also, 8's a lovely even number. So I was kind of attracted to these as the idea of using these as the moral ruptures in the fabric of the kingdom. So when you travel to a new valley, specifically actually to the fastness, like if you just go visit a valley and visit their market, your characters may not even notice this stuff. But when you visit the fastness within the valley, the GM tells the group which of the 8 evil thoughts afflicts this place. And then kind of as a group, you sort of do the classic painting the scene. What is it you see that shows you it's under the sway of this particular one? And then they have to sort of take actions to free this place from that. And if successful, then the charism of that place flows forth, which is sort of based on your fruits of the Holy Spirit. So basically, it may turn into a center of learning or of wisdom, or it may become like a village where somehow everyone just speaks languages magically. And originally, actually, that was a lot more transactional. It was like, hey, you liberated the village, now you get the magic power that goes with it. And I realized that was too... Why was I making this an explicit reward just for fighting some monsters in a dungeon? And so I've sort of moved it away from that just to like be a desirable outcome. As one of the players pointed out, generally speaking, it's better to live near a normal town or one where people speak lots of languages than one which is under the sway of greed. So in that sense, it's like beneficial for the characters. But I wanted to move it away from this kind of doing tasks for fairly mundane rewards scheme and just kind of leave it to people. What do they feel they're getting out of it? And for them, for their characters, in the same way that in the combat mechanics, pointing a gun at someone takes away as many hit points as actually shooting them. So you've got to decide which of these outcomes is more desirable in the moment. Yeah, I sort of wanted to decouple the rewards of quote-unquote progress through the game from sort of those mechanical considerations,
That's awesome. Can we maybe, just to like make this really sharp in listeners' minds, can we maybe go through one of the fastnesses and its corresponding set of catacombs just to give people an idea of like what is in the game as far as this goes?
So yeah, Kalima Valley, aka Red Temple Valley. It is a long, narrow valley that is actually the eastern passageway to the kingdom. There's basically only 2 passes in and out of the country, and this is the second most important one. At the eastern end, there's the Whispering Pass beyond. There are various locations that are detailed, such as the Royal Kalima Theatre, where concerts and recitals of fancy operas and classical music are held. There's also natural landmarks, such as the Roaring Water Valley. It's got waterfalls and so on. There's the Hunter's Market, where you can meet various people, and there's sort of the seeds of a little mini mystery about a missing person to be found there. But crucially, the fastness is the Red Temple, which is a place of pilgrimage previously, but now mostly abandoned. And it's, if you imagine the sort of Petra style carved into the rock face buildings.
Right.
The lowest level of this is down into these narrow caverns, which are just naturally occurring, where the hermit monks used to fast and pray in the earlier years. And it's if you go down into there and if you're looking for it, that's where you can find the catacomb.
So when you're presenting this in the game, it's like, okay, you've arrived at the Kalima Valley. Like, I assume that there's like some revolutionary stuff that has to take place before you can go to the catacombs, right?
Well, yeah, usually there's a massive grand unified encounter table. And what's crucial here is which side sort of has most hold over a given location. So there's no like kind of encounters where it says definitely, the Crown armed forces are guarding this place or the rebels are here. Instead, it's about who's the top dog and who's the underdog, who has the most hold and who has the least. And so if you're in a city, then you're most often going to encounter forces of order, whoever's in control of this place. And as the further you get out into the wilderness, the more random it becomes, the more likely you are to be mobbed by a tiger, that kind of thing. You'll sort of have your standard encounters, and those again are quite random because it's, again, about the sort of fantasy non-fiction thing. So it's designed to be kind of hard for me to create a fixed narrative of what happens. But yeah, once you arrive in the valley to an extent, but certainly once you get to the fastness, that's the point at which the GM has to sort of step out of moment to moment, here's what you're seeing, and talk about the things that are going to be out of character knowledge. Literally say, this is the fastness that can be liberated, this is the evil thought that pervades this particular region, and then ask what the players want to do next about it. So there's sort of a bit of authorship that everyone has to do.
No, that's great. Clearing out the evil thought, that involves going into the catacombs, yes?
Yeah, I would say sometimes you'll want these to be kind of classic massive dungeons, perhaps, in the style of, well, maybe not Keep on the Borderlands, let's not go crazy, but something like, what's the one with the snake cult?
Against the Cult of the Reptile God, yeah.
Maybe something that size, but to begin with, I've sort of done just quite simple 4 or 5 chamber dungeons. There's no map, you just sort of proceed from one to the next, because they are a slightly dreamlike reality. And that's presented very simply just on a single double-page spread. each. And yeah, they just have like weird encounters. And when you finish the dungeon, you do the last chamber, then that's your part of it done. So for example, in the Kalima catacomb, the environment is natural caverns that are very confined. And you keep meeting these skeleton guards, basically, who are like dead military personnel who ooze motor oil. Don't ask me why. It just is. And there's like a chamber that has an overturned Jeep in it that's on fire, and the skeletons are all around that. I don't know, man. Look. But the point is, you've got to get past these things somehow to make your way to the heart of the catacomb.
There's something about the catacombs are sort of a dungeon, an abstract dungeon, but a dungeon. But they have these elements that are clearly real-world elements. They are elements that sort of echo like problems that are going on in the actual like kind of conflict. And so the Kalima catacomb having like a focus on motor oil, having like the appearance of vehicles and things like that, I think it's really great, right? Like to me, that makes it feel like a very unified kind of experience, right? While also being a very heightened reality, we'll say. I think that's pretty great. Let's just spoil it for listeners. Let's just go through the 4 chambers so they get an idea of what they're getting here.
Okay, sure. Do you want to start?
Yeah. So chamber 1 is a maze of stalactites, as you mentioned. There are wisps of stinging smoke in the air. Importantly, guarding the entrance to chamber 2 is this sentry. It's a skeleton in a military uniform drenched in motor oil, which I think is just such a stark, grisly image.
Chamber 2, you must crawl on all fours through a narrow tunnel to reach this circular cavern, and the air is full of coarse black smoke. Oil-drenched uniformed skeletons are poring over a strategic map spread over a large table, and the oil drips down onto the map and gets smeared across the landscape.
Chamber 3 is where we have a huge fire, this is where the smoke's coming from, built from logs, tires, and an overturned Jeep. And there are people there warming themselves by the fire, except sort of jarringly, they are dressed in like formal attire as if they're going to the opera. Again, kind of a little allusion to like the Kalima Valley with its like, famous opera house. And there's oil constantly seeping from their heads and flowing down them. Just a great stark scene.
Yeah, and then finally, this one only has 4 chambers. The last one is empty, except for a single man who kneels motionless on the floor, and he's overgrown with thorns. When you see him, you understand instinctively that he's the source of the corruption. And when he is forgiven, he sinks into the rock, and the catacomb fades away.
And the evil thought is cleared, yes?
That's right.
I love it. That's great. It sounds like the gameplay loop here is you are traveling to these places, these various valleys and locations in the region. You are having random encounters from the tables, which are very military, the revolutionary part of the game, right? Like you might have to be doing some stealth, you might have to be doing some squad combat, that kind of thing. And then once you have time to sort of like be in the place, in particular, once you sort of get to the fastness, you then sort of start to have this like more spiritual thing where you have to go and like cleanse the land. That's the basic gameplay loop,
yeah,
right?
That sounds about right, yeah.
That's awesome. I think Revolution Comes to the Kingdom is super cool. I love what I've seen so far. I want you to tell us about sort of how you're rolling the game out. Where can people get it? What is the release plan? Because this is sort of being released in parts, right?
Yeah, so because this is such a niche thing, right, I said I couldn't really, man, I've got a family to support. I couldn't really justify to myself, like, spending 2 years or something writing this and then publishing a book or something. I don't know. So what I did is it's coming out, 1 monthly update at a time on Patreon/Porcupine Publishing. And I can add new pages to the ongoing PDF each time. 4 or 5 that you'll know are definitely new, and then some things where I've fiddled with some rules
zhuzhed up the previous stuff.
The usual Patreon thing. And then I'll separate out the new pages as well, so you can just download them. And I know it's kind of annoying because I'm not really into that monetize your hobby thing, but getting paid a bit helps me to justify some of the time I spend working on it, sometimes up to half the time. And I found it interesting since I started, like the sort of dynamic that's at work in the Patreon, which I sort of did it a little bit without thinking it through. But yeah, it sort of works. So I sort of get to feel okay about doing it. And obviously, the more patrons I get, the better I'll feel. But also, like, as long as I'm fulfilling my side of the bargain, right? Like, providing $5 worth of gaming fun every month, that's okay. especially if you're at the $1 level, because then it's a steal, right? So that's good. And then also it forces me to keep working on it. Like, it's not going to get left fallow, because every month I think, oh man, I better write something for the Patreon. At some point, it'll be complete enough to just kind of say, all right, that's done. And I can release it into the wild, and it won't be a Patreon project anymore. But it's already playable. I know that because I've played it. But the things to come are improving how it looks in the organization. It's a little bit of a dense thing right now, a little bit overstuffed, I would say. A bunch more valleys to talk about and do more things about how the setting works, and more to the point, how the toolkit for creating your version of the setting works. And then the other thing is I need to write down, explain how I run the game to make it work the way it works at my table. And then everyone can ignore it and do what they want anyway. So I think in terms of mechanics, there's not really going to be anything huge that will be added now. Maybe things will be taken away, in fact. But yeah, like it's a case of putting in the little support things that you need to have the complete kind of 8 valley game. Like right now, I would say you could start playing and do 1 to 3 valleys and things, progress that much. And then like as time goes by, it will become more complete. So. And if nothing else, then you just get a little mini dungeon that's full of weird stuff every month. So hopefully that's good enough.
All right, awesome. So Patreon release, staggered release. Every month you add something new, you refine it. What are the levels there? Like, what do you have to pledge at to get that?
$1. And there's a $5 version.
That's easy pledge.
Yeah, $5 I think gets... I should look this up. I'm not going to say on the recording what it is because I've forgotten what the terms are. Basically, $1 a month gets you the updated PDF every time.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, is there anything else you want to say about Revolution Comes to the Kingdom, Tom, before we go?
I'm too lost in it to know what I should say about it. Yeah, if anyone can think of a good elevator pitch for this stupid game, please let me know, because it's impossible.
Elevator pitch is key, right?
Yeah.
If you can get it down to one sentence, that's gold, practically, right? Like, everybody loves a one-line pitch. We'll work on that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about Revolution Comes to the Kingdom. I think this is going to be really great for folks. Folks, if you want to support this, you're going to go to patreon.com and /Porcupine Publishing.
That is correct, yeah.
Awesome. And that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, again, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to effervescent editor Rich Rogers, who presumably wasn't expecting this episode.
No, probably not. Thanks, listeners. Take care. Hi listeners, I want to let you know about Codex Starlight 2, the newest issue of our indie role-playing game magazine, coming to the Gauntlet Patreon feed in early March. Codex Starlight 2 is one of the biggest and best issues yet, and it features Snipe Hunt, an original game inspired by movies like Red Dawn and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which a teenager takes a group of kids out into the woods for a snipe hunt in order to protect them from a calamity taking place in the town they live in. Bed, Breakfast, and Beyond, a one-shot hack of Brindlewood Bay about an elderly gay couple who run a bed and breakfast trying to figure out why guests keep disappearing from room 3. The Temple of the Peerless Star, a trophy gold incursion inspired by the dungeon made famous in the Discern Realities podcast and later published for Dungeon World in the original Codex Starlight. We've taken the core of that dungeon and expanded it for trophy gold, and it's great. 3 dozen more signs the stars are right, a miscellany sequel, 7 original illustrations, and a custom layout. You can get Codex Starlight 2 in the Gauntlet Patreon feed in March by making a $6 pledge. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks.